Beyond the pyramids, beyond all you think you know, lies an undiscovered Egypt.
It's like putting together a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
For the first time, walk where only pharaohs have walked.
To the ancients, it was the sublime of the sublimes.
Journey to where no television camera has been allowed until now.
It almost looks as though the artists put down their brushes and left the temple yesterday.
Now Peter Woodward reveals startling new discoveries about an ancient land, Egypt, beyond the pyramids.
Cairo, one of the world's great cities. Bulging with 16 million people, it straddles the Nile River not far from the ancient capital of Memphis. For more than 5,000 years, since the days of the pharaohs, Egypt has been a land of intense faith and spirituality. In many ways, it became a crossroads for some of the world's most prominent religions. Here in Cairo, the greatest Muslim metropolis on earth, one has only to listen to be reminded. The cacophony of modern life is punctuated 5 times each day by the Islamic call to prayer. Cairo is filled with hundreds of mosques of all ages and sizes. The great mosque of Sultan Hassan was built in the 14th century. It is a stunning display of enormous spiritual inspiration. But Judaism and Christianity have also found strength and motivation in this city, and their temples of faith are also here. The Ben Ezra synagogue was built in the 9th century. Legend has it that before the Nile shifted its banks, Pharaoh's daughter found the baby Moses on this spot. Cairo has numerous churches as well. Most are Coptic, a sect that was one of the earliest branches of Christianity. I visited the 4th century Hanging Church, where it's possible to sense the unbroken spiritual ties to Egypt's ancient past. If one were to find the look and sound of ancient Egypt today, then it would be here, at a Coptic church. The words of these prayers and chants are the closest clues we have to the spoken language of the ancient Egyptians. And the devout faith of this service is a direct link to the deep spirituality of pharaonic Egypt. The chants, the incense, the hieroglyphs still used in the Coptic language can be traced to an even earlier religion that began here more than 50 centuries ago. Today, Cairo's houses of worship serve as a tangible link to that time. A time when magnificent temples provided the spiritual foundation for one of humankind's first great civilizations. The power of ancient Egypt's pharaohs was rooted in a complex hierarchy of gods and goddesses. It was a religion that prized ritual and ceremony. The temple was its centerpiece, a place of wonder and mystery.
Temples were points of contact between humanity and the divine. And the Egyptians basically conceived of the temple first and foremost as the god's dwelling place. So the basic purpose of the temple ritual was the care and feeding of the god.
The second function of the temple was to physically represent the Egyptian concept of creation. Egyptians believed that the world began as a morass of primeval muck, a place of chaos and disorder. But from this morass, the gods pushed up a mound or island of safety, which became Egypt. To symbolize this mound of creation, temples were always built with a slightly raised section in their center. The temple mound reminded Egyptians that the primeval chaos could return if the gods were not happy. For over 3,000 years, fear of chaos and longing for order were central to religious beliefs of Egyptian civilization. The line between the two was very clear to the Egyptian. The desert was chaos and the absence of life. The valley, nourished by the river Nile, was security. The temple was the institution that kept Egypt safe.
The god assured stability. It prevented chaos. You know that in the center of that temple, the god is there watching over you, and that Pharaoh on your behalf is going to make the proper offerings to that god, and that the world will continue to function properly. The Nile will rise, the floods will come, food will grow. It's all a reciprocal process that continues throughout time.
Temples quickly evolved to represent more than a home for the gods. They became the focus of all life in the community.
When you think about the temple in ancient Egypt, you're really thinking about something that's much broader than a religious place. It's a religious and economic place, something akin to, say, a great monastery in the Middle Ages in Europe. It owns land, it has herds. These were great economic institutions within the structure of Egypt.
The first temples date from the birth of Egyptian civilization over 4,000 years before the Christian era. These earliest holy places were probably little more than walls of reed mats or animal hides. Later temples were built of mud brick. Amazingly, some of these structures have survived. The huge mud brick temple of the early pharaoh Khazakemwy at Abydos is over 5,000 years old. But Khazakemwy's great walls were the exception. Most of these early temples vanished long ago, worn away by the relentless desert wind. This is a mud brick. Nile mud mixed with straw, baked in the Egyptian sun. Every early building from the pharaoh's palace to the peasant's hovel was made of this. In the right dry conditions, these can last for thousands of years, like at Khazakemwy's temple in Abydos. But most of habitable Egypt was close to the Nile and subject to constant flooding. After a few centuries, this stuff just dissolves back into the Nile. And the Egyptians knew it. Now, that's all right for the houses of the living. After all, life is just a temporary stage. But for the tombs of the dead and the temples of the gods, they had to last. The Egyptians were about to become the world's greatest masters of a new material, stone. And with it, they created some of the greatest monuments in human history. We've seen the beginnings of temple construction in Egypt, and now we see its magnificent culmination. This is the Temple of Karnak. And after the pyramids, it is the most spectacular architectural achievement in the history of Egypt. It is the greatest temple complex ever built. It grew to cover over 60 acres, a space large enough to enclose the Cathedral of Notre Dame and its grounds. Karnak Temple sits on the east bank of the Nile in what was once Thebes, the southern capital of ancient Egypt. Today, it is the city of Luxor, some 450 miles south of Cairo. A succession of pharaohs built and expanded this great temple over the course of 2 centuries, some 1,200 years before the Christian era. This great collection of gateways and column-filled halls was built to honor a single deity, Amun, the king of the gods.
He is the great god, the #1 god in Egypt. Because of that position as king of the gods, he receives the favor of Pharaoh. And all of the great halls that exist in here, the pylons and everything, are built for him.
Along with his wife, Mut, the goddess of motherhood, Amun ruled over the capital of Thebes. It was Amun, more than any other deity, who served to legitimize and continually renew the authority of the pharaohs. In the darkest, most silent recesses of Karnak, the god Amun resided in the form of a statue. Surprisingly, the statue was not a huge colossus, but a small image that could be easily carried during festivals. The lengthy walls of Karnak were made of huge sandstone blocks. The construction challenges faced by the builders were enormous.
Remember, we're not talking about cranes or even simple block and tackle to lift these enormous stones into place. Instead, the ancient Egyptians relied on dirt. Here we see the remnants of an enormous ramp up which the stones were dragged to their place in this huge pylon or gateway. As each course of stone was completed, the ramp was raised. When at last the wall was completed, the ramp was slowly dug away, and each course of stone was dressed with carvings and paintings on the way down.
The great hypostyle hall is the heart of Karnak. Begun by Pharaoh Amenhotep III in the 14th century BC, the hall is a forest of 130 columns, which once supported a roof over 80 feet above the temple floor. Windows in the roof admitted light which flooded the dramatic central aisle. But the side aisles, so sunny today, then would have remained in dramatic shadow. 15 obelisks dedicated to the sun god Re were lifted into place throughout the temple. It took all of the engineering skill possessed by Egyptians to carve the massive shafts, drag them up dirt ramps, and carefully settle them into place. The tips of the obelisks were once capped with gold, so they might catch the first sunlight at dawn and the last at twilight. The glinting light from these shafts honored the sun's primary importance to sustaining all life. This great collection of monumental stonework was not erected by slaves, but by free citizens, for all Egyptians were expected to be available sometime during the year to work on the pharaoh's great construction projects. It was the equivalent of national service.
The labor that put these temples together is the common people. They're serving their labor time. It's their week to go work in Karnak. It's probably, one, we've got to pay our taxes. Two, we're working on the home of the god. This is a great service to the king and to Amun. We're ensuring the stability of life throughout eternity by building here.
Although average working-class Egyptians built this temple, they probably were allowed to enter only the outer courtyards during the festivals. These inner halls were entered only by the most elite class of priests, for it was here that the god's spirit was most present. Each pharaoh in his turn felt called on to proclaim his devotion to Amun, and while he was at it, his own greatness. The walls and columns of the temple functioned as posters or billboards, where the king's adoration of the god could be recorded and displayed to the world. Dr. William Murnane of the University of Memphis has been studying the inscriptions at Karnak Temple for over 30 years.
I guess my interest in this building starts with simple curiosity. I mean, it is so well preserved, and it's silly not to know very much about what made it tick, why it was built. I'm interested in what it tells us about the religious mentality of the ancient Egyptians. The only safe way you can begin to understand what the significance of a building like this is to understand what they carved on its walls.
Simple photography of the inscriptions is difficult. Over hundreds of years and a succession of pharaohs, carvings were placed on top of older carvings. Murnane carefully traces everything so that all the layers may then be minutely studied. For sometimes, these images are not what they first appear.
One of the things that you find constantly being emphasized in the temple is this balance between the way things are and ought to be and what's actually happening in the temple. And I think you see that Very nicely illustrated over here, you have this bird, which is a hieroglyph for the common people of Egypt. And notice it's seated on a basket, which is another hieroglyph, which means all. And the bird has sprouted arms. It's not because it's a genetic mutation, but because this is part of another hieroglyph. Egyptians, seeing those arms outstretched, would think of instantly the word for adore. And in case you missed the point, the star, the five-pointed star, is another Egyptian hieroglyph that basically means adore. So you've got all the people adoring the king. Details like this have suggested that this was not just a symbol of humanity adoring the god king, it's also a logo for a basically illiterate society. And remember, after all, in Egypt, 1 or 2% of the elite knew how to read and write. So for most other people, something like this would tell them, when you see this on the column, you can stand there.
A bird that's actually a crowd control sign is only one of the surprises that can be found here if you know where and how to look. The average visitor today might also be surprised that all of this drab stonework was once painted in stunning colors. The few sections of painted decoration which remain give us a tantalizing glimpse of Karnak's fabulous past.
Sorting this stuff is really urgent because, as you can see, the wall is flaking away. These name rings that you see above me were intact when we photographed them in 1992. They're practically all gone now. So every time I get fed up with the tedium of what I'm doing, I basically come back here and I remind myself what a race with time we're in and how it's important to record this stuff before it disappears.
Sadly, groundwater in Egypt has been rising since the construction of the Great Aswan Dam in 1969. Like a sponge, the porous nature of these ancient stones now draws this water and the poisonous salt it carries. But other Egyptologists are continuing the struggle to unlock more secrets still held within these wondrous walls. We're in the heart of the Temple of Karnak, the Holy of Holies, where the statue of the great god Amun was kept. The roof is gone now, but 3,500 years ago, this place would have been very dark and very quiet, with only the most privileged priests allowed to enter. Each morning, one of them would open the doors to the shrine of the god himself, whose statue stood just up there. And then the statue would be washed, given his morning bath, and anointed with precious oils, and then dressed in the finest clothes. Offerings would be left. Here, perhaps, flowers or oils. And on this great table, food would be laid out before the god so that he could refresh himself during the day. Of course, the god only took the essence of the food. After a suitable interval, the actual stuff was eaten by the priests. Finally, they would leave incense burning, and then the god would be allowed to enjoy his day in peace. The higher priests at Karnak were appointed by the pharaoh. Other priests were part-time laymen from important families. But there were many jobs at the temple that had little to do with its religious functions. Temples were not just the domain of royalty and priests. Hundreds of common people were required for the day-to-day operation of these huge religious centers. Farmers, carpenters, stonemasons, metalsmiths, potters, and many more were all employed by the temples and relied on them for their physical as well as their spiritual needs. Charles van Sicklin is currently excavating the site of an ancient workshop that once served Karnak Temple.
At one point in the history of Karnak Temple, this was the manufactory. This was the place where they made the statues. This was the place where they made jewelry. They processed copper. In this particular area, we've got a lot of mixed signals about what's going on. I have places where I have concentrations of dirt filled with metallic flecks, which we haven't checked out yet, that look a lot like a word we don't talk about in Egyptology. The G word, which is terrible. Gold is the G word. Archaeologists hate to find gold because it's only a problem and it never tells you anything.
The age-old allure of gold has disrupted more than one dig site. For serious archaeologists, its presence only serves to distract from the search for more important discoveries.
There are a whole series of basins, one on top of the other. They go down for over 4 feet. And they were putting stuff in and letting them have sediments. The sediment would filter out, and then they put more liquid in and out. Maybe they were trying to extract some of the gold. That's probably the best theory this week. It's a problem I haven't solved yet, but that's archaeology.
All facets of Egyptian daily life were dependent on pottery. Jars, bottles, basins, bowls, pots were everywhere. It might be assumed that every piece of pottery is dug up and kept. But over 3,000 years of history make for a lot of broken pieces.
Most of this area is littered with literally millions of potsherds. This is a potsherd that I usually refer to by the Arabic word zabala, which means trash. It's part of the body of a piece of pottery, so it has no characteristics that will tell me anything about it. So we toss it.
As the centuries passed, the cult of the great god Amun withered, and Egyptian civilization was overrun by other cultures. Karnak Temple was finally closed by the Romans in the 4th century. When at last Europeans saw Karnak in the 18th century, its great halls were filled with sand. Campfires blackened the beautifully painted walls, and only peasants and their donkeys looked upon the holy inscriptions once meant for gods. But as the 21st century begins, Karnak is again filled with energy and passion. Only now it is the passion of discovery and restoration. Today, no one lives here at Karnak. The sands have been cleared away to reveal these, hundreds of blocks of stone. With slow and precise detective work, François Lachet and a French team have achieved the impossible. From these random blocks, they have managed to reassemble a whole building. They have recreated the Red Chapel of Queen Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was one of Egypt's few female rulers. In 1487 BC, 4 years before the end of her reign, this dynamic queen built a small temple just outside the walls of Karnak. Made of red quartzite, it became known as the Red Chapel. It was used for only a few years. For reasons we don't fully understand, Hatshepsut's successor and stepson, Thutmose III, had the Red Chapel dismantled. By the time Egyptologists found it over 3,000 years later, the only visible remains were a few large blocks of stone. François Lachet was fascinated by these blocks.
When I came to Karnak in 1987, I saw the blocks of the Red Chapel and I asked about it. And most of my colleagues were telling me that it was impossible to reconstruct this building because too many blocks were missing.
Lachet and his team set out to do the impossible. Fortunately, some of the stones which were once the walls of the Red Chapel had been carved to tell a story. Unfortunately, most of these stones had been reused in other parts of Karnak. The challenge was to find them and put them back together.
The first operation to be done for this study was to take around 2,000 pictures of the faces of these blocks.
The photos of the chapel blocks became a template for Lachet to work from.
It's like putting together a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. You don't have the box, so you don't have the picture, and half the pieces are missing.
The Red Chapel had been designed to hold a small boat. The boat was used to transport the god Amun in the important annual festival of Opet, held each year at the onset of the flood. During the procession, the boat of Amun was carried out of Karnak and paraded in front of the common people on a day-long journey to meet the king. At this meeting, the king paid homage to the god, and the god renewed the pharaoh's right to rule for another year. Scenes of this journey were depicted on numbered blocks, which had been set in the chapel wall. Once Lache discovered some of these blocks, he had the key to understanding the order of each course of stone. If 5 blocks in a course were each 30 inches long, it was logical the missing block in the order would have the same dimensions.
The scenes with the shrine and the scenes with the priest carrying the bark have the same length. So it was quite easy to add these lengths to the missing parts to reconstruct a part of this entire third course.
When the puzzle had finally been put together on paper, it took only 9 months in 1998 to reconstruct the main portion of the Red Chapel. Sadly, some blocks were never recovered. The smooth plaster on these walls fills the space of those missing blocks. It will eventually be stained to match the colour of the original stones. Work still continues on the Red Chapel as some missing pieces are recreated by hand. But for the first time since the New Kingdom, we can look upon Hatshepsut's beautiful shrine and marvel at what had once been lost to us. I think it's fascinating to try and imagine the mysterious and dramatic scenes which once unfolded in this marvellous little chapel. The one day in the year when the average Egyptian could actually see the god Amun-Re was the festival of Opet. The god would be removed from his sanctuary and brought here to the Red Chapel. Inside, on this very spot, was a small bark, or boat, which would carry the god on his journey. He was placed inside the bark, and shaven-headed priests with leopard skin robes lifted the holy bark onto their shoulders and carried it out of the temple of Karnak towards Luxor, over a mile away, down the Avenue of the Sphinxes. Trumpets blare as the god's procession approaches. Soldiers in plumed-covered chariots line the route. Spectators sing and clap as musicians pluck lutes and beat drums and cymbals. Dancers sway to the rhythms, acrobats spring through the air. And everywhere, the people cheer at the sight of the life-giving god. Much of Karnak Temple remains to give us a wonderful sense of what this place was like 3,500 years ago. But the effects of time, wind, earthquake, and even vandalism have taken their toll. We must also look to other temples to help us appreciate the mystique of Egyptian temple design and the delicate beauty of their decoration. One of the greatest of these was built while Karnak was thriving. It was created by Pharaoh Seti I, the father of Ramses the Great, to honor Osiris, the god of the underworld. I wanted to see this very special temple, so I traveled just a few hours down the Nile from Karnak to the ancient town of Abydos. It's Friday, the holy day of the Islamic week here in modern Egypt. You can hear the muezzin calling the faithful to prayer. What we have left of ancient Egypt is its religion: tombs, temples, monuments. But to the people of those times, that's what Egypt was. A living religion which directly involved the whole people. A religion which lasted with very little change for 3,000 years. We've seen the glories of Karnak, but to really appreciate it and to understand the power and the impact of these New Kingdom temples, you have to come here to Abydos, this extraordinary temple built by Seti I for the god Osiris. Few tourists ever come here, and parts of this temple have never been filmed. Our guide is Matthew Adams of the University of Pennsylvania. So Matthew, tell us about this amazing place. Where are we?
Well, we're in the first hypostyle hall of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, and we've just come in from the sunlit world of the living of ancient Egypt, and we're moving slowly into the more dimly lit world of the divine.
So Seti I originated this temple. What was his purpose?
Well, from at least the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BC, Abydos was seen as the primary cult place of the god Osiris, the ruler of the land of the dead. The Egyptians believed that he had been buried here, that his tomb was out in the desert here. And Seti wanted to associate himself with the cult of Osiris. And in building this great temple, he was able to do that. I think that this is probably the finest relief carving ever done in Egypt. It's absolutely exquisite.
But take us through them.
Well, here we see the pharaoh, Seti I. He's holding an incense burner. You see the flames from the burning incense coming up there.
Very clearly.
He's offering this to an image of the god Osiris, attended by various other deities. You see Osiris enthroned on a raised platform here, inside a shrine, which is just indicated by these thin lines that encircle the image.
Where would this shrine itself have been?
Well, the temple had a number of chapels dedicated to various deities. One of these was dedicated to Osiris, and this image, or the image that this represents, would have been in that chapel.
Can we go and see?
Sure. This is the chapel of Osiris, and we see him in various guises here, with the king making offerings of incense and libation offerings, adoring the image of the god. It really gives a sense of what the original decoration of most Egyptian temples would have been. It would have been this incredibly vibrant and alive color. It almost looks as though the artists put down their brushes and left the temple yesterday. The images here help us a great deal in understanding the nature of temple ritual, but the Seti temple here isn't only important for Egyptologists to understand gods' cults and temple ritual, it also has a singular significance in Egyptian history. On the wall in this room, we actually have one of the most important historical documents from ancient Egypt. It's something that has been of immense value to Egyptologists in understanding the sequence of Egyptian history. It's a list of the names of the kings of ancient Egypt. Starts at the beginning with the name of King Menes. Here it says Meni, who was the legendary founder of ancient Egypt, and it continues all the way through most of the rulers of ancient Egypt, all the way to Seti, here at the end, who built this temple.
So it's an amazing stretch of history, isn't it?
Absolutely. This represents almost 2,000 years of Egyptian history.
And it's just a list. Is that the only importance it has? What else does it tell us?
Well, it tells us of the Egyptians' own awareness of the great depth of their history. Egyptology would have had a much more difficult time in putting together the overall outline of ancient Egyptian history without this document and others like it.
Although Seti I is the last name on this list, he died before his temple could be fully completed. It was finished by his son, Ramesses. But history will forever know it as Seti's gift to the ages, a beautiful monument to the deep spirituality and artistic greatness of ancient Egypt. In 1570 BC, 1,000 years after the Great Pyramids were built, a new era in Egyptian history began. It was called the New Kingdom. The great pharaohs of this period, such as Seti I's son, Ramesses, possessed enormous power and prestige. They would expand and perfect an altogether different category of temple.
We're crossing the Nile at the site of the ancient holy city of Thebes. Just down there on that bank is the town of Luxor and the temple of Karnak. But it was to this bank that the pharaohs turned to create a new kind of temple. These were not dedicated to a particular god like Amun at Karnak or Osiris at Abydos, but rather they were mortuary temples dedicated to the honor of a living god, the pharaoh himself.
Pharaohs had always required a site where, even after death, they could receive praise and offerings. A suitable place where their memory could be worshipped on a daily basis. It was not enough for the body to remain preserved. The glorious memory of the dead king also had to be maintained, if he was to keep his proper place in eternity.
Pyramids had spaces for such activities incorporated into their design. But when tomb robbers forced the pharaohs to seek smaller, more secure tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a need was created for a special memorial structure. The result was the mortuary temple, and one of the most elegant of these was built across the river from Karnak by Ramesses II. The spectacular temple he created is known as the Ramesseum. It was a fitting monument to the pharaoh known to history as Ramesses the Great. Its location, the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, was really an enormous cemetery complex covering dozens of square miles. The great mortuary temples the pharaohs built here were all very close to each other. Just down the road from the Ramesseum is Medinet Habu, the beautiful temple built by Ramesses III. And not far away from this spot sits another great testament to power and ego.
We're on our way to visit the most spectacular of the mortuary temples, a temple that was built to honor one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, a pharaoh who was not a king, but a queen.
Her name was Hatshepsut, the same queen who had built the Red Chapel at Karnak. Initially, she was less a queen than the wife of a king, Thutmose II to be exact, but when her husband died, the title of king passed to a boy, Hatshepsut's stepson, Thutmose III. The boy was too young to rule, and so Hatshepsut became regent to command Egypt until the young king matured. But this remarkable woman possessed great self-confidence and abundant ambition. In the second year of her stepson's reign, Hatshepsut had herself designated king. She decreed that she would now be depicted not as a woman, but as a man, complete with the traditional false beard of a pharaoh. Hatshepsut's reign was peaceful and Egypt prospered. Trading expeditions were sent to distant lands, and the queen mounted enormous building projects. None were more ambitious than her construction of a temple to memorialize herself.
Nearly 1,500 years before the Christian era, Queen Hatshepsut began the construction of a temple to honor her reign. She chose this spectacular site, a natural amphitheater of stone. Cliffs 1,000 feet high. Today, it is called Deir el-Bahri, but to the ancients, it was the sublime of the sublimes.
Hatshepsut's architect was named Senenmut. Some believe he was also her lover. She asked him to design a temple which would amaze the ages. He did not fail. No builder in ancient Egypt had a greater sense of theatrics than Senenmut. 3 perfectly scaled terraces rise out of the valley floor and seem to meld with the towering cliffs which surround the temple. Carefully proportioned ramps connected these tiers. Statues of the queen were everywhere, and in the soft tones of the desert dawn or twilight, the temple's stones gave off a magical glow, which proclaimed to eternity Hatshepsut's sanctity and greatness.
But fame can be fleeting. Hatshepsut's control of this wonderful temple was to be brief. Work on this architectural masterpiece began in the 7th year of Hatshepsut's reign and continued for 15 more years. This temple was built in her honor, so her image is everywhere. Hatshepsut as pharaoh, Hatshepsut as the god Osiris. But although her temple is still here 3,500 years later, most of the images of the great queen herself were destroyed soon after her death. Thutmose III became pharaoh of Egypt in 1483 BC. He was convinced that his stepmother should never have been pharaoh. So, as his reign came to an end, Thutmose did his best to obliterate the queen's image from her own temple. But time was the greatest enemy here. Later occupants continued the defacement of carvings, and earthquakes tumbled walls and columns. By the 20th century, Hatshepsut's beautiful temple was in a sad condition. Paving stones had heaved out of line. Huge blocks from balustrades lay collapsed in jumbled piles. But in 1960, the Egyptian government funded a restoration project, working with a group of Polish Egyptologists. It's been a model of international cooperation. Critical parts of the temple, particularly the 3rd tier, lay scattered like a huge stack of children's blocks. The first task was to analyze these blocks and, one at a time, put them back into their places. We were granted access to sections of the temple that have been closed for more than 30 years. It was a rare opportunity to see the restoration work up close. Old methods are used to recreate the missing parts. Stone is cut from the original quarries and brought here to Deir el-Bahri. Local Egyptian carvers are separated from the original artisans who worked here by thousands of years, but the care and attention to detail is identical. Each one of these stones is cut by hand, placed by hand and eye, shaped to exactly fit. And then, after this one, they have to go step by step up this great ramp to the 3rd tier. And for the first time since ancient times, it'll be complete. There's hundreds of men working here. You can imagine in ancient times, thousands working side by side in the heat to complete this great monument. With funding limited, there is no modern machinery here. Instead, workers bend their backs to their heavy loads. To provide a rhythm, they cry out a work chant in praise of the Prophet Muhammad. Like their ancestors centuries ago, they pull these great stones up the ramp using only their hands. And of course, these guys have got wheels. The ancient Egyptians, well, maybe they used sledges. It's still hard work. These limestone blocks are modern, but they're cut to exactly the same tolerances as the ancient stone would have been. And each block is a copy, an exact copy of what was here before. Like a piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle, a section of Hatshepsut's original temple is eased into place on its modern counterpart. Piece by piece, Deir el-Bahri is put back together. Funds for this work are difficult to obtain. It has taken over 30 years, but at last, the end is in sight. And we can again see Egypt's great queen gazing over her marvelous temple. Each year during a special festival, the god Amun-Re would be brought here, to the 3rd tier of the temple of Hatshepsut. the statue of the god would be taken in procession across this courtyard, back there, into a cavern dug into the mountain. There he would rest for a few days before beginning his progress through all the temples of the West Bank. The public have never been allowed access to this place, but soon the work of restoration will be completed, and visitors will at last be able to stand here on the sacred terrace and enjoy a view of the Nile once looked upon by Queen Hatshepsut herself.
Like all ancient structures in Egypt, the great temples face many threats from time and the elements. Paintings continue to fade, inscriptions erode, rising groundwater threatens foundations and puts important carvings at risk. But through the work of many dedicated people, these great mansions of the spirits thankfully remain. They proclaim to history the unique relationship of Egyptians and their gods.